It looks like Zoom is just letting everyone in just now. So that's cool. So let's get started. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in to this MFC session on the CFO's Guide to Accepting Off-Platform Payments. I'm very pleased to have this session supported by our friends at Stash, and Archie is indeed one of our panelists. Post the ruling against Apple, we were getting a lot of questions within the MFC around what's this mean, what could it mean. So we were able to put this panel together at fairly short notice, and again, thanks to Stash for stepping in here. And then I think, yeah, we're ready to get into it. So again, the session's on accepting off-platform payments since this ruling. Maybe I can just run around the panelists quickly, get them to do a quick intro, and then we can get into it. Eric, you're top left of my screen. Do you want to give us a quick bio in case anyone doesn't know who you are?
Sure. I've been in the industry about 25 years. I've spent half my time covering video game companies for investors and half my time in industry, including EA and Kabam. And the last 6 years, I've been doing the Deconstructor of Fun podcast, where we talk shit about everything that is gaming on a weekly basis. That's me.
Excellent. John, you're next in my screen order.
Yeah, so I'm John, slightly less amount of years, so 20 years in the industry. I started on the production side, worked on numerous Battlefield titles over at EA, and then I moved via Paradox Interactive, handling IT and analytics. And now I'm at Snowprint Studio as COO, so managing most of our overhead functions, so finance among other things.
Hey, so I'm the head of product at Stash. We are a off-platform direct-to-consumer channel builder for mobile game studios. And before that, I was in the investment world. I worked at a fund called Makers Fund, where I invested in games companies.
Cool. Eric, if I can call on you to do just maybe a quick recap of what happened. So the Epic versus Apple battle had been brewing for a long time, but maybe we can just go over in case of what, at a very macro level, just to set the scene, what actually happened and what the path forward might look like with lots of caveats around it. Just maybe a couple of minutes.
Okay. I think actually Archie's much better in terms of the legalese of all this stuff. But what I will say as an industry kind of analyst, generally speaking, Apple has been a very poor partner since the beginning, really. They've been actually evil in the way they've approached publishers. And the 30% that they've been commanding over these years has just not made sense because they haven't made the necessary investments to justify that 30% at all. And so I think Epic put out the good fight, a fight that really I thought no chance that they would ever win. And now they have won, right? To some degree, anyway. And what that means is that we no longer need to use Apple for payments, and we could use your own payment mechanism to have your customers pay, which actually is a huge margin improvement for the publishers, in theory, anyway. But there are a lot of other challenges to that. But the big difference between this and then the DMA thing in Europe is that this is app payments versus app stores, and app payments are far more less friction than app stores, which have catered more towards the core games with the whale-driven economies than the casual like puzzle. So if you can implement web payments, which is just a direct payment in app, it's just going to look exactly Apple's current payment system. So that could be a huge boon for the publishers just in general to streamline that and get rid of the 30% and pay only the transaction fee. But Archie, can you?
I was going to go across to Archie, and basically the caveat here is this is just in the US right now. So this is by no means some kind of global thing. We'll get into some of the challenges of what that presents just now. But Archie, from your side, that was a nice one to wake up to. I mean, from your side, maybe just to add what the potential benefits to publishers are from it.
Sure. So the ruling that came out of the US courts most recently was just confined to anti-steering provisions, which are the restrictions Apple places on how and whether developers can inform their users of alternative payment routes and options. So that's what was ruled to be illegal, and that's what Apple has now removed from its App Store policies, which is great. It's not a replacement for native in-app payments necessarily, but it's a huge development. And it partakes in a broader shift you've seen towards direct-to-consumer, which has multiple motivations. By far the largest and most significant is that you can reduce your cost of sales from 30% to single digits, which you've already seen drive enormous margin improvement at developers like Playtika Scopely, Zynga, etc. But the other benefits to it are that in direct consumer channels, out of app experiences, you have no restrictions on the kinds of things you can sell or offer developers. There are a bunch of restrictions on App Store functionality that still apply everywhere. Prohibitions against offering store within store functionality, or for example, selling IAPs that unlock functionality in multiple games. All of that is something you're not allowed to do through the App Store channels, and you can through out of app. In addition to that kind of enhanced functionality and margin, you also have various ways you can improve your user acquisition funnel and just generally get direct player information. So you remove any third parties from that data stream, and it means that you have direct access to player identity information, emails, etc.
So that there's that kind of first level, hey, we can reduce the actual tax or cost, whatever we're paying, from say 30 down to single. But actually, I think there's a host of other things, and certainly some of the other calls I've been on, people can think about new different creative ways to engage. A lot of the lockdown has been reduced, so it offers a lot, both on I guess on the attribution side, on the type of promotions you can actually do, and so on as well. So I think there's a lot of secondary benefits. And then John, from your side, you've been on this journey a little bit already, so you were arguably ahead of the curve here. But what's been your kind of most recent reaction and experiences to the things?
I think we're still evaluating what the legal side of things means. So for us, the important part has always been to make sure that we can give our players the best possible experience. And by offering certain things, certain elements that isn't possible on the main platforms, this obviously could potentially open up to do a lot more on outside of the game, for example. But we have been working on improving the community experience outside of the game already, not necessarily specifically on the payment side. We have things like loyalty programs and other types of enhancing experiences outside of the game, which most publishers do, by the way. So it's nothing unique to us, but this is definitely another potentially
Driving a whole new wave of innovation and ways to engage with the players. So you're very much, as a company, I know you're very much sort of players first and player focused. So just using this as a segue of new functionality and things as well. So I guess there's the talk of what has changed. And I don't know, I'm sure I haven't seen anything particularly strong or groundbreaking from Apple in any way challenging it or coming back with something aggressive or anything. I don't know, you guys might be better placed to hear if there's anything brewing or if you've seen anything, or whether they just accept it as the new normal. I guess the thing is, if a lot of people were playing a wait and see, then at what stage do they start to think more seriously about D2C strategies if this was something that was preventing them before?
The question for me, or
No, I'll take it really quickly. So the feedback I'm getting is that it's very unlikely that Apple doesn't come after this decision. Like, they have an ability to appeal this and get a stay in terms of people executing against this. I think we don't really know exactly what's going to happen, but I don't think Apple's going to take this lying down at all. And it's clear to me that they still will fight it with technology and UX and communication to the users. They'll do whatever they can to maintain this 30%, but they're definitely losing, right, as we go here. But this is not like something immediately, like this is turning on the ability to do direct payments like immediately. Like, it still has to be done with quite a lot of care and to make sure that you don't piss off Apple too much, because they're vindictive, right? And they will respond. Google, evidently today I was reading something and it's unverified, but they're already communicating to their customers that you want to use their app store versus others because you want to stay in the fold. Like, they have a marketing message about not going off payments of Google, right? There's a lot of things that they can do as big tech giants to thwart this, and they will do everything they can to do that.
Archie, anything you're hearing from the grapevines?
Yeah, tons of developers we speak to are in like an exploratory phase. I would say that there's a bunch of developers that already have web shops or some kind of direct to consumer channel and are now thinking, what additional functionality can we build that would capitalize on this ruling, like where Snowprint is? And I would say for those guys, most of what I'm asked for is, do you have case studies of how people are implementing this? Nobody really wants to go first. So now that we have both Fortnite's example, now that Fortnite's on the App Store, you can see how they've implemented link outs, as well as developers like Supercell doing more direct and more aggressive link outs. And then even before this ruling came into effect, games like Monopoly Go had pretty very smooth user experiences that linked out from within the game to their web shop, although that linked out through loyalty. So I think as more of those examples accumulate, more and more developers are going to feel more comfortable implementing their own direct link outs. Mostly what I get asked for is real life case studies, so that we now have more kind of demos that we can show people that's helping them understand like what this can look like. But I'm interested to know what is it that will finally push a lot of those developers over the edge. There's also developers, particularly from genres like Match and Merge, that haven't traditionally adopted web shops because they think that the purchase experience is so impulse based that they don't want to introduce any friction, and they just think adoption for the web shop would be too low. And so I'm very interested in how those kinds of developers are now re-examining those strategies in the face of this ruling, because one of the things that this ruling allows you to do, at least how we've implemented it, is our checkout links product stash pay. It opens in a web view. And so what it means is you don't have to, a bit like Eric was describing, you don't have to end the session to complete the purchase. It's just as smooth, but nearly as smooth as using Apple's IAP, which makes now direct to consumer much more viable for those kinds of purchases and those kinds of games. So I'll be very interested to see if any of the major Match guys, for example, really enter the space now that's more viable.
Yeah, and sorry, the thing that Google Play is doing right now, it's called download apps, not traps. So they're doing a marketing machine out there to make sure that people don't go off the web store, off their own store. So I imagine Apple will do similar type of
Yeah, there was a talk of the red triangle, right? This has started to appear a little bit more, saying, warning, you're about to go outside of our kind of payment system or something. It's a bit like ask app not to track. It's, as you said, Eric, it's like using that the UX to FOMO people, if you like, or fear, uncertainty, and doubt rather about going off there. But yeah, ultimately, if the players are incentivized by loyalty discounts or new things, I'm sure maybe the younger genres, the more experimental ones, where people will be happy to get their heads around that. But I'm sure and then just from an operational point of view, that we're talking about a US ruling here. So in every other territory, it's not available. But what's the thinking from you guys, I guess, from John, if that's relevant, and from Archie about the sort of like the operate, just the, not so much within the product itself, but just within the overall kind of planning for different routes?
I think John can take that.
I'll take it really quickly because I did look at this. Obviously, the US ruling adds just a lot more global pressure because really the DMA was leading the charge in terms of coming after this 30%. So it actually helps facilitate it. And most likely DMA will take on this ruling and bring it into their fold and allow web payments as well as web stores. That's my thinking, is that they'll come on board. It may take 6 to 12 months, but they're the ones that are being the aggressors out there more than the US. Yeah. Generally speaking.
Yes, I think just on the regulatory side, Eric's exactly right, that what you've had is like the US being a bit of a laggard because they're not passing any new legislation, whereas the UK and the EU have, as well as Korea and Japan, have all passed really targeted new legislation that's in its intended purpose is to enable more competition in digital markets. And this is a huge piece of that. So they have been going through this iterative process with Apple of finding them. Apple comes out with some newly compliant policies. The DMA, the EU says that's not good enough, and then Apple goes back and redraws them. I think this has set a fairly clear operational standard that the EU can now work towards. People might not remember this because it was overshadowed by the ruling a week later, but the week before the App Store ruling in the Epic case came out in April, you had a DMA fine of Apple of €500 million. And so Apple still has to respond to that. So I think this is the minimum of where the UK, the European Union, Korea, and Japan will look to end up as well. And then in America, you actually have on the book standing, like this ruling in the Apple case has been standing for 4 years. These things take a while to implement. But the ruling in the Google case is far more radical than this. And so if the Android ruling is placed off injunction, I would anticipate it going a lot further than this because the stated ruling asks for 3 years for Google to open up its App Store completely. But in the interim, I am really interested in the developer perspective of how much complexity does it introduce to be operating two different clients in the US versus the rest of the world for the time being. I'm very interested to hear how developers are thinking about that problem.
Also, the other question I have for developers is if you're doing multiple payments, because there's no way you're getting rid of the Apple payments within your app, but you have a dual payment option in which one is your app, your payment, and one is Apple payments. That creates some complexity, UI, UX, consumer experience, conversion issues, all kinds of things that kind of materialize from things that you're creating friction ultimately from the purchase experience.
Yeah, John, what was your thinking on that in terms of, because this pulls together everyone, this pulls together finance and it's an operational and product and it basically touches pretty much everything in the company.
Yeah. So just to be clear, we don't have that today. So it's more of a what are we thinking or what am I thinking on this topic? To begin with, the two apps, I think that's the most complex part of the question. The first part, having a separate app in the US as compared to the others, that is something we genuinely would like to avoid simply because it also makes things like if a player from a certain region is facing another player, how do we solve the complexity of different databases talking to each other? So I think as far as humanly possible, that is something I would recommend to avoid, to be honest. But when it comes to more the UX challenge of offering different options on how to pay for a product, sure, it increases friction, but that's a lot more simpler, especially if you're, say, a larger company that is used to conducting A/B testing. You would simply just test your way forward with what works, what doesn't work, what do we want to offer our players, what payment methods are viable in what regions, etc. So it's not really that different from just having or running a payment provider. With that said, we started off this meeting by saying, or Eric started off by saying that Apple has really been evil and so on. I think we shouldn't forget that as a smaller developer or a startup, it's a pretty frictionless way of starting your business and getting all the payment things in place without having to worry about a lot of those things. So I think, and also Eric pointed out with the economy of scale, like if you're a huge company, you have all these things in place, then it makes total sense to look at increasing your margin by 1%, or in this case, maybe 20% or so.
It feels like there's a tipping point because if you're four guys sitting on beanbags knocking out games, the fact that someone's prepared to take care of all the payments infrastructure, merchant of record, fraud, chargeback, that's a bonus, right? But if you're doing $100 million a month, then you're right. Every little incremental piece is going to make a huge difference. So there is probably there's a big versus small argument in here, and it'd be interesting to plot out really where the pain points are, the revenue inflection points. It really means it's worth doing that versus you're just grateful for the fact that someone's sorted it.
Yeah, and so after talking to about a dozen people or half a dozen people about this particular ruling and how it impacts the industry going forward, the biggest takeaway I get from everyone agrees more or less is that the biggest beneficiaries to this are the big, right? Because they will have the capability of actually executing against this quickly if they so do so, and they will capture a lot more lion's share of savings. But then also for all the UA people, because a lot of this money is not going to, the money saved is not going to the consumer. Let's be clear. It's going straight into the companies, and the companies will likely use that money for UA. So that'll go right back to AppLovin and Unity, or not Unity anymore, but AppLovin and Facebook and Meta and Google. Those guys are the ones that are going to capture the majority of the share, is that there's going to be more UA spend, and those savings are likely going to go straight into UA spend, which actually is a huge benefit to the big as well, because they will continue to dominate the UA spend. And ultimately, cost of acquisition will go up, which actually penalize the small as well. So that's the kind of dynamic we're seizing. And then you see like AppCharge and Stash and Xsola probably benefiting tremendously from people moving off Google Play and Apple. Those definitely are beneficiaries. But that's my conclusion, is that ultimately the big are just going to get bigger with these type of savings. But I would love to hear a counter argument to that.
I think we'll see. I think we'll see. I think the onboarding flow I actually think that if the direct link out option becomes pretty viable and consumers get educated to it, then the friction for launching that is a lot less, or the operations involved in launching that is a lot less than like web shops, for example. And so I think that depends on how this is productized, but I think like our SDK for this is a lot more potentially self-serve, like plug and play, let's go, and that's a lot better experience than anything you could do previously. So I do think that this will enable an easier implementation of D2C for a lot of smaller developers.
But that also implies that there's no countermeasures from the platforms or backlash from the. It's far easier for Zynga to do whatever the hell they want to do than it is for a smaller publisher to, I don't know. But
yeah, it depends. I mean, there's also, you benefit from being somewhat anonymous, right? So I think that like the bigger guys draw more scrutiny as well as probably get away with a bit more. I think also developers have this idea that if you violate policies, you get kicked off and then you're done for. And that's not how the app stores have worked traditionally. Like Monopoly Go is a good example. When they launched their VIP, their Tycoon Club link out interface, Google actually told them that it wasn't acceptable, so they just had to remove that from the game on Android. And so I think the enforcement measures for this are a lot less like draconian and arbitrary than a lot of developers suspect, and that in reality, if you do implement something the app stores they'll tell you to remove it. And if you do that, you're fine, because they benefit as much as anyone from you making more money on this. And so I think smaller guys do benefit from being able to get away with greater risks, right? Like it's pretty existential. Monopoly Go will do everything it can to avoid getting kicked off the app stores, whereas I think smaller guys have a little bit more wiggle room with what they experiment with. They're anonymous.
Yeah. You can see it. You can see it both ways, right? You got to think that if you've got $100,000 of revenue a month and you occasionally get some nice featuring that puts you in the realm of some nice organics and just about makes your business work, that you're probably off the Christmas card list when it comes to any featuring, and you're going to be more on your own in terms of that.
I would just say, if you think that's the case, go look at who's featured right now, and you'll find every single one of the featured games is a huge player in D2C. Like all of the Scopely games. Scopely is one of the most proactive direct to consumer. So I think people attribute a lot more kind of competent malevolence to Apple than actually exists. And that in fact, the decision-making apparatus of editorial on the App Store is very different from anyone who's getting you in trouble for App Store review. I know that's the case because I've spoken to App Store editorial team members who are like, we don't care. So I think that the like actual people at the app stores whose incentive it is to really crack down on this stuff are very different from a lot of the people we interface with.
And we all know that featuring is no longer even relevant anymore in terms of really driving downloads. Like they messed up the app store so badly that it's just a joke, right, of the industry. So it's not, that used to be what the threat was, because featuring actually meant something. And so if you did something against their wishes, they would not feature you, like full stop. Like they never featured Social Casino, for instance, because they don't like Social Casino. But they don't have that kind of leverage anymore. Their real leverage is not allowing you to update your app, right?
Yeah.
If you go against their terms of service, they won't allow you to like change your app. And that's what they have hold over. And yeah, and so there's some nuances to your argument about big versus small in that case, but I don't want to go into it too much. But anyway, the materiality of getting your big app, your $100,000 app, and that's all you have, getting that removed from your store versus the Scopely example where, they can't do that. They can't actually fuck with a Monopoly Go game. They know that. But anyway, whatever. Yeah.
That's good to know, because this came up just literally a week ago in our town halls. Hey, if I go down this strategy, presumably that's going to mean that featuring all these things are dead. It's really good to actually hear some empirical evidence that is actually not the case.
Featuring is dead just in general. Like it's useless. Like the App Store is useless. There's this misperception that there's some kind of discovery on the app stores. There's no discovery on the app stores. All discovery is user acquisition, right? This is the game that we're in, right? Like it's all about Facebook or sorry, Meta, all the stuff that AppLovin's doing. That's where people find apps and download apps. It's not from fucking browsing the store. That's just not the way it works. So
Yeah, we have.
I would agree with that.
Come
I
on.
think we still sometimes encounter like some vague sense of, oh, but I don't want to annoy the app stores. But when you ask studios to really interrogate that question, they tend to not really have, there's nothing there. It's more of just like a vague sense of, oh, like surely I must get something from Apple and Google. But I'm just looking at which games I'm featured right now. And with Marvel Contest of Champions, D2C, Clash of Clans does D2C, Strike Force D2C, all of them do really aggressive D2C.
Yeah, no, that's really good to know. We're teasing out some good points here. And then Eric, there was something that you mentioned before around the again, slightly back to the sort of like the practical aspects around data leaks, fraud, privacy, all of these other things that folks take. You go from a kind of like a single merchant of record, like a nice sandbox to play in, but there must be there's some implied risk in terms of if you start to widen the net there. That was a point that we raised.
Yeah, look, I will give Apple credit, right? They created a system, Apple and Google, they created a system that was far easier to deal with than before that. When Jamdat was making 600 SKUs for every single phone and every single app, sorry, every single phone, every single OS, different configurations of the phone back then. When you have like one device, like 3 or 4 different SKUs of one device, like Apple and Google, that makes it so far more seamless. And with the payments perspective, it makes it much, much easier to actually execute against one system for each device. And on top of that, Apple and Google both were really relatively diligent about fixing huge problems of fraud and abuse on their systems, whether it was like all the hijinks around app rankings and false reviews and all these things that were going on behind the scenes. So the minute that you eliminate that benefit that they have provided all these years, there's all kinds of risks in terms of security from the perspective of the consumer, whether it's privacy, credit card fraud, all this bullshit that these advertisers were doing in order to push downloads and stuff like that. So there are a lot of risks associated with that, the things that Apple and Google have done pretty well at over the years.
Yeah, but that, and then maybe at the very largest of scale, you might get into a kind of build your own homespun, handcrafted. But if you can go down the route by working with a provider who's thought through a lot of this stuff for you, then it's gonna take it off as well. And versus the whole, I'm gonna build the whole thing from myself from scratch.
No, exactly. But
Yeah,
no
I would agree
offense
with
to
that. I'd be interested to hear John's perspective. So John and Snowprint are customers of ours, and I'm interested in your guys' accounting of, did you guys consider building this yourself, or how did you make the decision to end up going with us?
No, I think just so everyone is aware what our size is, we're 55 people. And so from our perspective, doing everything by ourselves would just be a complete distraction, loss of focus, and basically building a side team that isn't contributing to the main experience, which is our games, and that's where we want to be. So that was not really an option. And then looking at where we ended up, maybe, and no offense to Archie here, they were not a complete build out at that point, but we're looking for a way to also have a large impact on what was being built and in what order and priority. That was most important to us and our players. So I think we've had a good cooperation there. And I think it's, for example, just as an example from a financial point of view, reporting, which is one of the most boring aspects of working on the finance side, maybe. I'm sure there's people that love that. Taxes, all of that stuff that you would otherwise have to worry about. You would have to file taxes in 20 different jurisdictions. All of that is taken off of our hands and into Stash's hands. So we're very grateful to have that handled. Again, would we have had a finance department of 10 people? This would probably have been a different conversation, because then we would just have one of our people doing that, and that would be it. So again, size matters, but I definitely see a market for this type of middle layer of service, depending on what you want to focus on in your business.
Yeah,
And
I
it's
think
not,
John's
for us, it's not reporting. Let's put it that way.
That's exactly the kind of partner. And yeah, Snowprint were our first customer. So it was a really great partnership we've had with them and really has helped us understand where we can be most impactful because, as John mentioned, we basically want to focus on being experts and all the stuff most studios don't want to. And so if you look at the question that was asked, does it make sense for studios to move forward today with implementing direct checkouts? Like, I would say yes, definitely, especially if you work with a partner that can take a lot of this stuff off your hands. And a lot of these flows are now far more developed than they were certainly when we started working with Snowprint over a year ago. And so particularly for the link out functionality, which can be a lot less complex, like our Stash Pay integration is incredibly light, which is our link out. It's an incredibly light integration compared to the fuller web shop integration that we do. So if you want to move forward with something that's quick and you can test it very rapidly, and then if you want to invest in it further, you can. And if it gets rolled back, it's a very light lift. I think actually the direct checkouts is a really good entry point now for studios to start implementing something in D2C.
Just to
You go, Archie.
just add a nuance to answering that question. I don't know, is that visible to everyone or?
Oh, so yeah, just I'll read out the questions in the Q&A just now. It's probably a good time. John, thanks for it. Thanks for spotting that. Does it make sense for studios to move forward today with implementing direct checkouts or hold off until a decision is made for Apple's stay on this ruling?
Yeah, so I think the nuance or the addition to Archie's response here is also that I personally wouldn't just answer that with a clear yes. The last part of the question, like Apple stay on this ruling, I think you should do it for the right reasons, that it's strategically right for your business, and that not necessarily that it's anything specifically against Apple. I think then you're going after the entire off App Store market, not just the extra margin on iTunes or App Store.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And we've had new customers come on board in the last month with a combined link out and web shop package like product, which I think 100% is the right way to do it. Because also, no matter how smooth this experience gets, I don't think it'll ever be as smooth as in-app. And so I often think about direct to consumer as pulling two levers. You have the increasing players' motivation to go direct to consumer and decreasing their friction, because fundamentally this is all about, can you make it worthwhile for the players? And the link out makes it a lot lower friction, but there will still be some friction. So you still have to give players an incentive and a reason to go direct to consumer. And as John mentioned, building out a more fully thought through direct to consumer offering helps you craft that kind of like total player value proposition, whether it's loyalty or rewards or some other engagement mechanic that actually gives players a reason to opt into direct to consumer that can be deployed in link out. So whenever we do direct link outs from the app, those all support all of our loyalty and rewards infrastructure that we support in the web shop like we've done with Snowprint, which I think is by far the best player experience and the most cohesive developer strategy.
So is it then relatively easy to see, okay, what are the big guys doing here? What are they experimenting with? What works in the core gameplay, and then to be able to replicate that in their own way without having to reinvent the wheel? Because it strikes me from where I'm sitting, the financial benefit is clear. The user acquisition benefit is clear and stuff, but it's like what's harder to get your head around. Can we really use it as a something where the whole's more than the sum of the parts if we can enhance, move the needle? Because for a long time it's just been the rules has been the rules, and you have to operate within them, and there's been very little scope for creativity on that type of front. I don't know. I'm not enough of a player to have seen anything particularly new, but presumably there are those guys out there pushing the boundary somewhere.
Yeah, the one point I want to make though is that the success of a lot of the web stores to date for Xsolla and AppCharge and Archie's joint stash has been primarily like the core games, right? Where it's like the super hardcore like whales that are spending thousands and thousands of dollars. So offering them discounts is really meaningful for them. And so that's where the uptick and the taking of the web stores has been, I think, the most dramatic. Correct me if I'm wrong on that one. So if you're only spending a couple $100s here and there over years, are these discounts as relevant? Are you going to risk putting your information out there, your credit cards and stuff like that? Like the conversion of the minnows is just probably not as interesting going forward. So I don't know.
I think that's
I think
broadly true, but if you imagine the link out flow using Apple Pay, that's an incredibly smooth experience. And so I do think it'll be interesting to see if there's more opportunity to monetize those guys with link outs. I think Eric's general point is correct, which is that like principally the reason direct to consumer has been so popular is because free-to-play economics is such that you don't need to shift 50% of your user base into direct to
Yeah.
consumer to see an impact.
It's like 1%.
Yeah. And I think
1% of your downloads
that
matter.
remains broadly the case, but I do think link out will probably open that up a bit broader to different monetization because you can have whales in a non-core game, right? Or maybe not whales, but you can have reasonably high spenders in a match game. And so I think that those users will probably be more addressable for link outs than they have been for web shops.
And
Right.
what,
And so,
sorry, I was going to
this
ask
is
about subscriptions. Is like, is for casual
No.
games, is that a good way of getting folks on
No.
subscriptions or?
no, subscriptions are a terrible business model for gaming. Just full stop. It's a
It
joke.
depends on the subscription. I think you'll see an increased popularity for them. I think that a flat subscription that doesn't have any microtransactions on top of it doesn't make sense for a lot of games.
Yeah, and then subscriptions offer another problem is like the impossibility. Like right now, Apple makes it so easy to cancel subscriptions, like from within your phone. With new providers coming out there, they can make it absolutely impossible to get rid of subscriptions, which is a key business model for subscriptions, is people that lapse just to keep paying them. No, I don't think subscription revenue, like if you can't include subscription of currency type things within games, if it's a part of a whole, but pure subscriptions for gaming does not make sense, period, end of sentence. That's a dumb model.
I disagree with you.
Yeah, but Warcraft, that's a different game. Okay. Anyway, but that's not free to play like mobile is. The broader point that I wanted to make about this, and the reason I actually started looking at this in the first place is because Mitch on Game Changers was talking about all these changes to the payments and distribution are going to change the face of the industry. Discovery is going to get easier. There's going to be places to go. The duopoly has created this big problem with distribution, all this stuff. And this is when I went down this rabbit hole trying to figure out what this actually means for the industry. And what I want to be clear on this is this does not improve discovery. This does not necessarily improve the dynamics. This is not going to actually expose new genres to the industry. This, again, is a capture of the big in a sense that this is going to be a real big cost savings for them and a benefit for them to pour more money into UA, which is where most of the money is made in this market, right? Is UA arbitrage. So anyway, I don't think I agree with what they're saying in terms of how this could democratize the industry and create better dynamics for the small. I just don't think that is the case. And so part of the reason...
Is a takeaway here then potentially really quite bad for the small guys because it just makes UA more expensive, raises the bar. They don't have the bandwidth to implement multiple payment systems or the product savviness to make them slick. So potentially bad for those guys, potentially good for the medium guys who are looking at this, who have a certain level of scale, which makes it worth their while, but they can't afford to build everything out and have all the BI and so on, as well as the tax and compliance and the rest of it. But you think, Eric, the big winners are the ones that are the big studios, are the ones that clean up here.
Yeah, you actually articulated it much better than I did. Yeah. So, yeah.
I would say I don't think we're at a state where we can say this is bad for the small guys because I don't think the onboarding flow, I don't think the implementation viability of doing this for small guys will be that high. I do think that this potentially makes direct consumer a competitive necessity as opposed to a luxury. And that just means it's bad for anyone who's not implementing some version of direct consumer. But I don't think it's a foregone conclusion. That's not viable for smaller developers. And certainly for mid-tier developers, I think it's definitely viable.
No, I totally agree with you. It's viable to include this within the smaller developers. I'm not suggesting otherwise. It does. This ruling in the US actually makes it much easier than it was before when it was just web stores. Like web stores is a big thing, like an implementation of the medium to the big. Web payments are far easier to implement. I'm not suggesting that. What I'm suggesting is that all the savings that are resulting from any type of web payment stuff will go straight into UA, which will make it more expensive to acquire in every genre. And that will be a capture of the big. That's my point, really. Yeah, I don't think, the cost of implementation is not really the issue, particularly with web payments versus web stores.
We've got just about 10 minutes to run. One of the things that, John, I was going to try and get your finance hat on a little bit, just in terms of, and this may not be the kind of like the sexy big picture stuff, but just in terms of the nuts and bolts stuff, anything that you've you obviously had a pretty good deep dive into this, but any nuggets or tales from the trenches, if you like, that you could impart for anyone with a financial and operating hat, looking at the actual, not the reasons why to implement, but the actual tales from the trenches of actually getting stuck in the reporting, the tax, the compliance sorts of issues.
Well, as soon as you start looking at the details, there's nothing positive popping out really, except the increased margins. So I think it's easy to underestimate that just because you're gonna get reporting solved, taxes solved, it's still another store, right? It's still another set of reports coming in that you need to chug through every month, make sure that the bookkeeping is in line. So don't underestimate the extra admin that it entails. I don't know if that's from the trenches or just
This is, you're there and doing it. A lot of people will be, I think, looking on the sidelines. There's definitely a kind of wait and see. Hey, obviously it's been moved forward. Like, should we wait? Should we wait a few months and see what happens with Apple? Ultimately, there's a direction of travel that as I say, it's when you want to get on the bus, if you like. But I think from the audience, I can see quite a lot of folks here today. So, okay, this is becoming a thing. And with a CFO hat on, you really want to start getting your head around the practical implementation. So any sort of...
So I think the main thing to bear in mind is that it does take a bit longer than you initially think, because the cliche, but devil's in the details. The easy part, implementing, integrating 90% goes really quick. And then you start discovering that, oh, what about this? Oh, do we use points or commas? Do we... And it quickly adds up. So it adds calendar time to get it into perfection. So again, it's not something to just do a quick cash grab. It needs to align with your strategy. It needs to be a long-term commitment in order to actually make sense.
Yeah, from a reporting and I did FP&A for a while, which was the bane of my existence, frankly. But from a
reporting.
Yeah, from a reporting perspective and a forecasting perspective, are you having two sets of books that you're like tracking and integrating within your like financial systems? Like I can imagine what a nightmare that would be, forecasting the web store versus forecasting Google versus forecasting app. And then you start bifurcating it further down. Is that what you guys have to end up doing from a finance
In a
perspective?
sense, yes. And that's also tied to UA, because you need to track the UA and the ROI on the UA per channel, et cetera, et cetera. So it is one more channel / store to handle. Yeah.
And have you guys seen any type of user acquisition stuff? Like, I would imagine improve retention of people that use the web stores, right? Clearly from a purchase perspective or consumer perspective. Is there any way of leveraging it to acquire users? Is that the other big thing that I've been trying to figure out, if that's even possible?
It's a bit outside of my core knowledge, but in general terms, I would say it is another in, and it's definitely an in where you can track the entire funnel, which isn't always easy when you go via an external app store, be it Google, Apple, or Steam on PC. There's always that blind part of the funnel where you then try to tie together. This is what we thought the person we sent in, and we believe it's this player coming out over here. Owning that entire funnel obviously makes it a lot easier to refine your UA and make the better decisions.
Yeah, we've also been doing desktop distribution with Snowprint as well. So we have a launcher product that enables you, and there we've worked with their MMP Singular to implement some tracking. I think there's more we can do there, but certainly using the web for its visibility is like a huge priority for our roadmap.
Just with my very limited knowledge, and presumably if you can, on the MMP, if you can track down to when an ad was clicked, if you like. Now, okay, there may have been a bit in the middle where it's like it falls into a daily sales report and you're trying to fish it out and then stitch it back together. But if it's happening with a credit card payments event and that happens within 30 seconds or 1 minute of the ad, presumably that part of the attribution process, I mean, again, I'm outside my zone here, but I can see how that knitting them together becomes a little bit easier if you've got a bit more control of the data.
Yeah, definitely. And then you have, I'm not complaining here, but you have privacy laws and rules as well, which means that the platforms are more and more concerned about following those laws from their perspective and not necessarily what's best for the publishers or the developers. So it means that you have to start doing, you need to make assumptions when you do your attribution. And if you own the whole funnel and obviously ask for the right permissions from your players, then you get a much more accurate picture in the end.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, so the sort of takeaways I'm getting are it's different. The different stages are going to look at this. Different sizes of studio are going to look at this in different ways. Got different things to benefit from it, and that there's a direction of travel that is going one way. Yeah, you could be the guys who are going to jump in a little bit ahead of time, or there are some that will inevitably be sitting on the sidelines to wait and seeing what happens, and if there's some counter ruling, and if it was worth it in the first place, whatever. But I think no one can deny as is always the same. I remember all the walled gardens of the guys in the late noughties and stuff. It was all like the regulators will, the platforms do, the regulators will catch up and ultimately fall into play. Archie, what are you?
Yeah, the thing I'll just say is you said that you might be a bit of ahead, but I would say if you are not already doing D2C, you're way behind. 70 to 80. I actually think it's probably, I mean, there's some data on this. 90% plus of the top 50, probably 75% plus of the top 100 games are doing direct to consumer. And so I think if you're not already operating a web shop, you're well behind where the industry is actually, and need to play catch up.
My thought here is that if Apple does the power play here, they could basically reduce the fee to 15% or something like that, or 18% if they start to see mass adoption of the web stores, which would basically eliminate the need to go off the app stores, and then Google could follow suit. That is always a possible option within the next 6 to 12 months. And maybe they may be in that position where they have to do it. And then the switching costs would be just not worth it to me.
But if that happens and you stifle the ability to have different types of loyalty programs and some of the kind of innovation from a player point of view, maybe they care about that, maybe they don't.
No, they don't. And they care about the consumer. And so we're not, all these discussions are talking about the publisher.
Or
they don't give a shit about public. This is the biggest thing about Apple. They don't care about publishers. They don't care about game developers. They don't care about anybody but themselves and their consumer, right? And so they want to optimize the experience around their consumer and make it as seamless as possible for the consumer. And so when they realize that when they make that decision, when it gets to a point in which they're losing, 10, 15, 20% of app store sales, then it may make sense just to make it easier for the consumer and just make a decision that optimizes against what they want to optimize as the consumer, their service. So
maybe it's worth drawing a distinction between the consumer as someone who buys a phone and a player who plays a game on a phone that someone's purchased. See, it seems like the primary thing they care about is people continuing to buy phones, which is that side of the consumer. The player still plays a game, consumes. So what would it take for someone to be like, you know what? I'm going to go and buy a different brand phone because I want to be able to play the games I play without all this restriction. I don't know. Maybe that's extrapolating it a bit far. Are you ever not
consumer?
I wish.
Consumer. No. Consumers want an Apple phone. They want an Apple phone. Period. End of sentence. And some crazy people want a Google phone
on the phone that they trump as opposed to going looking for the game.
That may be a console thing, but that's not a phone thing. A phone is a phone, right? Like the best phone is an Apple phone. There's no doubt iPhones are the best. So no. They're not going to move because of some
consumers of the Apple phone.
We're not going to see a Fortnite phone. That ain't happening. That is not happening.
Cool. I don't see anything else.
I love talking about this stuff, and so I'm excited to just engage, even if you're not actively pursuing something, or even if you are operating a web shop already. Like I'll say, I think the standard for web shop quality in the industry is pretty low. And so we've spoken to a ton of developers who have had bad experiences direct to consumer. And I think that's largely because they implemented pretty poor solutions. So I think that this will hopefully lead to a new wave of adoption or reevaluation of D2C as a viable strategy for pretty much every large game developer, every medium to large game developer now.
Cool. John, from your side, you started the journey. There are some twists and turns along the way, but you're glad.
No, but I guess I can just echo what Archie said, that if someone is thinking about it, feel free to reach out and we can have a talk about it in more detail.
That'd be great. I can do any sort of point-to-point connections. If anyone needs to, I'll just reach out on the platform or on LinkedIn. Eric, one final soundbite from you.
Oh, I got nothing. What do you mean in terms of like why Apple's evil? No, I don't know. I got nothing.
Or-
Come on
or-
to the podcast. We're talking about this stuff all the time. All these issues come up on the podcast on a weekly basis. So I'll do a shill. Deconstructor of fun. So.
Excellent. Great stuff. All right. Thank you very much, guys, for taking part. Thanks to Stash for supporting. Thanks to everyone for tuning in.